The Illinois Railway Museum is America's largest railroad museum. With over 100 acres of land and over 500 pieces of equipment, IRM has earned a reputation for being on a large scale. Large scale doesn't mean perfect and better than the rest, of course, but IRM does invoke a sense of awe from its scale that can mostly be experienced in person. That being said, though, there is more to this museum than looking at cool trains in person, as the appreciation of these trains can better be accentuated through a virtual format. The history of these artifacts, the stories they tell, and their legacy in the fields of northern Illinois should be explored not just on forums and wikis either, but in video format as well. In this series, we will not only be looking at steam and diesel locomotives at IRM, but rapid transit cars, interurbans, trolleys, and even the occasional piece of rolling stock. A disclaimer, however. This is not officially endorsed by IRM. This is a fan project dedicated to their collection by me with support from friends and family. I am not a spokesperson for the museum, only a volunteer. My word should not be considered as definite for future restorations, projects, and so on. There will inevitably be some subjectivity in my words too, although this subjectivity should not be taken as what others should feel. Now, with that out of the way, it's time to delve into our first engine of the series, Frisco number 1630. The Decapod, one of the most odd designs to come out of American locomotive practice. Their rigid wheelbase and shallow fireboxes made them redundant on main lines with the introduction of larger freight power. However, many often found their way onto secondary lines, doing rural work on lightly laid branches. On the contrary, Imperial Russia was quite the emphatic user of the Decapod on the main line. Replacing 080, 280, and recent 010s, they were desperately needed during the demanding years of World War I. The Russian Decapods, the YE series, were all to be built in America during the war. Designed by Russian engineers to accommodate the short length of current turntables while still having a comparatively large boiler when looking at Russian contemporaries, they were an ideal machine working during the strain of war on the Russian Empire. However, that strain eventually led to collapse. 200 of these decapods were stranded in America following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, as the government could not afford the remainder of the order. This worked out for the American side too, considering the Red Scare was all too present in the States. Not wanting to waste locomotives during a time of crisis, the United States Railroad Administration, or USRA, acquired custodianship of these newly built locomotives. Since they were built to a gauge of 5 feet, the engine were given wider tires for their use on the more narrow 4 feet 8.5 inch gauge track of North American railways. One of these engines, numbered 1147, was leased to the Pennsylvania Railroad. It didn't last long on the Pennsy, however, and was then sold to the St. Louis-San Francisco Railroad, or better known as the Frisco, and was frequently used on local freight trains. During their careers on the Frisco, the Russian decapods were reported to be surprisingly slippery. As a result, several members of the class had their cylinder diameters reduced from 25 to 24 inches. While this did reduce their tractive effort from 51,490 pounds of force to 47,500 pounds of force, it boosted their rate of adhesion and their fuel economy. This was especially important, as these engines were never premier freight engines. New light Mikados diverted to the Frisco by the USRA ultimately outclassed the Decapods for mainline use. But the Frisco continued to tinker with these engines even after the fact. Each of the 210Os were equipped with a single thermic siphon to increase their heating surface, and the coal burners were equipped with stokers. During steam days, 1147, now renumbered to 1630, could be found on the former Kansas City, Osceola, and Southern's Highline route, even substituting on occasion for passenger trains 20 and 21, albeit at a maximum speed of 25 to 30 miles an hour for many stretches. This was a secondary route, no longer a premier mainline. But due to the light axle loading of the Russian decks, their moderate tractive effort, and the generous spread of weight on its 10 driving wheels, 1630 was perfect for this task. By October of 1951, 5 of the class, all coal burners, were purchased by Eagle Pitcher Industries to work in Oklahoma. Their tenders had their sides cut down to improve visibility, their headlights were raised, and yellow safety stripes were painted on. This purchase prolonged their lifespan, for the early 1950s saw the end of steam operations on the Frisco, and the end of the Frisco's other Russian decapods. Gone were the days of hauling quiet secondary trains through the rural heartland, for now they carried lead and zinc to an industrious smelting plant. They continued this job dutifully until 1958. Now more than ever, it seemed like the writing was on the wall for these engines. Surprisingly, however, Eagle Pitcher had the conscience to donate all 5 to various institutions. 1615 was donated to the city of Atlas, Oklahoma. 1621 was gifted to the National Museum of Transportation in Kirkwood, Missouri. 1625 was given to the State Fair of Texas before later moving to Frisco, Texas. 1632 was taken in by the Smoky Hill Railway and Historical Society at Ottawa, Kansas. And 1630 arrived at IRM on the weekend of July 29, 1967. For the first few years after arrival, not much happened with 1630. Steam operations in the early days were most often handled by ex-J. Neal's Lumber Company No. 5, a shade that returned to service in 1967. However, by the early 1970s, the IRM steam department embarked on restoring 3 more steam engines to supplement the Shay. Diesel preservation was in its infancy, so restoring more steam engines to pull non-electrified trains was natural. These steam engines included Tuskegee No. 101, Commonwealth Edison No. 5, and Frisco 1630. While the 2 former engines were ready by 1971, 1630 would have to wait a bit longer. In August of 1972, the engine was hydro-tested for the very first time, and on Members' Day of that year, October 28th, the engine was fired up for the first time in more than a decade. By mid-afternoon, the engine was moving under its own power and scuttling up and down the museum's Y. At the end of the day, the engine was even doing runs down the main line. When the end of the weekend arrived, with the exception of a few failing cylinder cocks, the engine was mechanically acceptable for service. Cosmetic and additional mechanical work was wrapped up in the following years. The engine maintained its Eagle Pitcher appearance, barring the lettering and the headlight, which was moved closer to the center of the smokebox front. Over time, the engine began to slowly resemble its Frisco appearance, with the last of these alterations, the doghouse on the tender, being applied after 1981. In 1982, 1630 made history as the first engine to pull a train on the half-a-mile mainline extension. A small increase in mileage, true, but a step closer to a different time. A time when decapods ran branch lines stretching for miles, passing farms and fields on a daily basis. With ComEd 5 going down permanently in 1974, and 101 being retired in 1989 in need of new tubes, the Shay and 1630 were the only operating steam locomotives going into the 1990s. In 1992, 1630, along with the Nebraska Zephyr, were featured in the hit film A League of Their Own. As the protagonists are rushing towards the station, 1630 can be seen parked on the Big Y. Furthermore, the engine appeared in the movie The Babe and on the TV shows American Playhouse and The Untouchables. Unfortunately, by 2004, 1630 was getting worn out, needing major work on the drivers and being due for a general overhaul. For the first time since 1967, IRM would not have an operating steam locomotive for the next season. At the time, IRM didn't have a working drop pit, and since there was no feasible way to elevate the locomotive, work on 1630 halted. But after 15 years of restoration work, the old Whiting drop table, acquired from the New York Central's Englewood Roundhouse, was fully functional by mid-2007, meaning that 1630's rebuild could begin. Six years later, on October 30th, 2013, IRM's 60th anniversary year, 1630 returned to steam. Still wearing its faded 2004 paint, the locomotive made a small jog around the museum yard, and even took a trip down the main line. The biggest update that occurred during her restoration was her return to Frisco operating specifications, now running at a boiler pressure of 180 psi. 1630 made her public debut during Memorial Day weekend of the following year. Except for her lack of Frisco lettering, the locomotive looked like it just emerged from a Frisco shopping. This lettering would be added later on in the 2014 season. It seemed as if life had returned to normal at long last for the deck. However, a starring moment was about to come. After finishing operations on May 29th of 2016, 1630 was called in for a peculiar task, moving 135 empty hoppers from the east end of IRM's mainline near Huntley to the Union Pacific interchange in Union. Normally, this would have been done with a diesel, but because 1630 wasn't cold yet, a cylinder rebuild having just occurred, and due to pre-planning by the curator's part, the timing worked out perfectly. Breaking doubts about the engine's capabilities, it soon became clear that this task was no problem for the elderly locomotive. In the golden twilight of that late spring day, 1630 hauled 17,000 tons of hopper toward the interchange point. To this day, 1630 holds the record for the longest train pulled by a steam locomotive in the 21st century. In 2019, two notable events occurred for 1630. The first was the commissioning of an ex-Illinois Central auxiliary tender specifically for 1630. This allowed for more water to be carried during the day's runs, eliminating pit stops at the water tower. The second was during Museum Showcase Weekend, when newly restored Shea 5 and 1630 performed a steam doubleheader, the first such occurrence in at least 2 decades. Out of all the steam engines that IRM has run over the years, 1630 has racked up a mileage far beyond all of them. As a result, it's taken a toll on the engine. On April 30th, 2025, it was announced that 1630 suffered from a mechanical issue prior to the start of the 2025 season. As a result, 1630's FRA 15-year inspection was initiated sooner than expected, as it was planned to go under in 2029. The source of the problem lie in the thinness of the superheater flues, as running 1630 with flues below a minimum thickness is obviously dangerous. These flues will be scrapped as they have reached their life expectancy, along with the main superheater units. The tender tank also needs replacing, as the thickness of the cistern in many places is also thinning. In addition, areas like the cab will be stripped of metal wastage material like Bondo, and new steel will be fabricated. Thanks to the careful procedures by the steam department for repairing its steam engines,
1630 didn't cause any issues in the midst of IRM's operations, nor posed a safety risk for visitors and crew members in the 2025 season. IRM has linked a donation page on its website and Facebook page to support the upcoming rebuild, and said page will also be linked in the description of the video.
It's clear that IRM loved to use 1630, and many consider it to be the steam engine there. While it is not the most popular steam engine in the world, nor even the longest running, 1630 holds a special place in many Midwestern railfans' hearts for simply being a part of the lives of multiple generations of railfans. Its operation may be on hiatus for the time being, but it's still an icon of Illinoisan steam.